What if the one thing that could save you wasn't a person, but a creature, with eyes that seemed to see straight into your broken soul? What if the weight of war, the kind that lingers long after the gunfire fades, could be lifted by a bond no one saw coming? What if redemption trotted into your life on four hooves, with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any therapist ever could? In the heart of Montana, under a sky so big it feels like it could swallow your pain whole, a story began that no one could have predicted. It's a story of a man who came back from war but left pieces of himself on the battlefield, a man who thought he'd never feel whole again. And it's a story of a horse, a creature as scarred as he was, whose silent companionship would change everything. But before we get to that miraculous meeting, let's step into the dust and despair of a life teetering on the edge. Jack Thornton sat on the edge of his sagging porch, the wood creaking beneath him like old bones protesting the weight of the world. The Bitterroot Valley stretched out before him, a patchwork of golden fields and rugged mountains, the kind of beauty that should have stirred something in a man's heart. But Jack's heart was a locked box, buried under layers of sand and screams from a desert half a world away. His calloused hands gripped a chipped coffee mug, the black liquid inside long gone cold, much like the gaze in his pale blue eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the kind you'd see on any rancher in these parts, but the way it hung off his shoulders told a different story, one of a body that had once been strong, now just going through the motions. The air carried the scent of pine and earth, a reminder of simpler times, when Jack would have been out there with his daddy, mending fences or breaking colts under the watchful eye of the Rockies. But now, at 34, he was a ghost in his own life. The scars weren't just the jagged line across his left forearm, a souvenir from an IED blast in Afghanistan. They were in the way his hands trembled when a car backfired down on Highway 93, in the way he'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the echoes of his unit's last stand ringing in his ears. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the VA docs called it. Jack called it hell on earth. He'd been back in the States for 5 years, but he was still fighting a war nobody else could see. Each morning started the same. Jack would drag himself out of bed before the sun peeked over the mountains, not because he wanted to, but because lying there in the dark was worse. The old ranch house, inherited from his granddaddy, was a museum of better days. Yellowed photographs of grinning cattle drives, a rusted branding iron hung over the fireplace, the faint smell of his mama's huckleberry pie still lingering in the walls if he closed his eyes long enough. He'd shuffle to the kitchen, brew a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and sit on that porch, staring at nothing. Sometimes he'd hear the distant neigh of a horse from a neighbor's spread, and for a split second he'd remember the boy who dreamed of rodeos and open ranges. But then the memories of explosions would creep back in, and he'd shut that door in his mind tighter than a steel trap. He tried to keep busy. Lord knows he did. Jack would tinker with the rusted-out Ford in the barn, the one his daddy swore he'd fix up one day. He'd chop wood until his arms burned, the rhythmic swing of the axe a kind of therapy no shrink could prescribe. He'd even drive into Missoula once a week for group therapy at the VA, sitting in a circle of other broken vets, all staring at their boots while they muttered half-hearted stories of getting better. But Jack wasn't buying it. He'd nod at the right times, say yes sir to the counselor, and drive back home with the radio off, the silence in the cab heavier than a Montana snowstorm. He'd pass by the local diners, where folks sipped coffee over slices of cherry pie, swapping gossip about the upcoming county fair or the high school football team's latest win. Jack used to be one of those folks, the guy who'd tip his hat and flash a grin. Now he couldn't even meet their eyes through the window. There was a crack in him, deeper than the fissures in the dry earth of his neglected fields. It wasn't just the war that haunted him. It was the specific weight of a single day, a moment he replayed every night in his dreams. He'd lost more than brothers in arms over there. He'd lost the part of himself that believed in second chances. He kept a small box under his bed, locked tight, filled with letters and a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. He didn't need to. The faces in that photo were burned into his mind. His squad, laughing in the dust of Kandahar before everything went to hell. Jack didn't talk about it, not even to the VA shrink. Some wounds bled too deep to stitch up with words. The days bled into weeks, each one a slow grind against the gears of his shattered spirit. He'd watch the hawks circle over the valley, envying their freedom, their ability to just fly away from it all. He'd hear the distant rumble of a tractor from Old Man Carter's place down the road, and he'd think about how life just kept moving for everyone else. For Jack, it was like being stuck in quicksand. Every step forward pulled him deeper into the muck of his own head. He'd tried meds, tried prayer, even tried drowning it all in a bottle of Jack Daniels until the hangovers hurt more than the memories. Nothing worked. He was a man waiting for something, though he didn't know what. A sign, maybe. A reason to keep going when every day felt like a losing battle. It was on a Thursday, under a sky bruised with the threat of a late summer storm, that the unexpected rode into Jack Thornton's life. He'd been out by the old corral, staring at the sagging posts he hadn't touched in years, when he heard the crunch of gravel under tires. His first instinct was to tense up, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, a reflex from years in a war zone. But it was just a beat-up Chevy pickup, rust-eaten and coughing like it had seen better days, pulling up to the house. A woman stepped out, wiry and weathered, her cowboy hat tipped low against the glare of the setting sun. She had the look of someone who'd spent her life wrangling more than cattle, maybe her own demons too. Her name was Clara Henshaw, a local horse trainer known for taking in the hard cases, the animals no one else wanted. Jack Thornton? Her voice was gravelly, like she'd smoked one too many cigarettes at the rodeo grounds. She didn't wait for an answer, just kept talking as she leaned against the truck. "I've got something for you. Or rather, someone. He's a bit of a mess, but then again I hear you might know a thing or two about that." Jack didn't respond at first, just watched as she walked to the back of the trailer hitched to her truck. His brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation cutting through the numbness. He wasn't in the mood for charity or small talk, and he sure as hell wasn't looking to take on some project horse. But before he could tell her to hit the road, Clara swung open the trailer door, and out stepped a creature that stole the breath right out of him. It was a horse, a bay gelding with a coat that might have once gleamed like polished mahogany, but now bore the dull sheen of neglect. His ribs showed through, his mane tangled with burrs, and a long, jagged scar ran down his left flank, a brutal testament to some past trauma. But it was the horse's eyes that hit Jack like a punch to the gut, deep, dark pools of something unspoken, a pain so raw it mirrored his own. Clara crossed her arms, her weathered face softening just a hair. "His name's Maverick. Found him at an auction last week. Half-starved and meaner than a rattlesnake. They were gonna send him to slaughter, said he was too far gone after whatever hell he'd been through, but I've got a feeling about him, and about you. He's got no place else to go, Jack, and I reckon neither do you." Jack stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart doing something it hadn't done in years, racing with something other than fear. He didn't know why, but looking into Maverick's haunted eyes felt like staring into a mirror. There was a story there, a shared language of loss and survival, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt the faintest flicker of a connection. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this horse, this broken, battered soul on 4 legs, was about to unearth a part of him he thought was long buried, a part tied to that locked box under his bed, to a promise he made in the dust of Afghanistan, a promise he thought he'd failed. What Maverick carried with him wasn't just scars, it was a key to something Jack had been running from for far too long. Jack Thornton stood frozen by the corral, the late summer breeze carrying the faint creak of Clara's trailer as it swayed behind her beat-up Chevy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding Bitterroot Valley, but all Jack could focus on was Maverick, the bay gelding whose scarred flank and haunted eyes seemed to pierce right through the haze he'd been living in for years. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "He's got no place else to go, Jack, and I reckon neither do you." It wasn't just a challenge. It was a mirror held up to the emptiness he'd been dragging behind him like a rusted chain. His chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming there, but this time it wasn't just the weight of war. It was the sting of being seen, truly seen, by a creature that looked as broken as he felt. He took a step back, his boots scuffing against the dry dirt, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I ain't got time for this, Clara," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel, barely masking the tremor beneath it. "I can't take care of myself, let alone some half-dead horse." But even as the words left his mouth, his gaze stayed locked on Maverick, on the way the horse's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, the way those dark eyes seemed to hold a quiet plea. Jack's throat burned with something unspoken, a mix of anger and fear. What right did this animal have to look at him like that? Like it knew the nightmares that clawed at him every night, the faces he saw in the dark, his squad frozen in time, forever laughing in that dusty Kandahar snapshot. Clara tilted her hat back, her lined face unreadable, but her tone steady. "Never said you had to fix him, Jack. Sometimes it ain't about fixing. Sometimes it's just about showing up. You think he's half dead? Take a hard look in the mirror, cowboy." Her words cut deep, slicing through the numbness he'd wrapped around himself like a second skin. Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment he wanted to tell her to load that horse back up and drive off his property. But something stopped him, a flicker of memory, not of war, but of his daddy's voice, low and steady, teaching him to gentle a colt with patience instead of force. "A horse'll tell you more about yourself than any man ever could," his daddy had said. Jack hadn't believed it then. Now, staring at Maverick, he felt the truth of it like a punch to the gut. He turned away, his boots kicking up dust, as he stalked toward the porch, needing distance from Clara's knowing gaze and the horse's silent judgment. His heart pounded against his ribs, a rhythm he couldn't outrun, and as he sank onto the weathered steps, that locked box under his bed flashed in his mind. The promise he'd made in Afghanistan to protect, to bring everyone home, burned in his memory like a brand. He'd failed them all. And now what? Was he supposed to save this horse when he couldn't even save himself? Guilt clawed at him, sharper than it had in months, mingling with a raw, jagged fear. If he let Maverick in, if he let anything in, he risked cracking open that box of pain he'd buried so deep. But ignoring the horse felt like turning his back on something bigger. Maybe the last chance he had to feel something other than ash. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat at the scarred kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey untouched in front of him, listening to the distant, restless snorts of Maverick in the makeshift pen Clara had set up by the barn before she left. She'd given him no choice, really. Just unloaded the horse, handed over a bag of feed, and drove off with a nod and a promise to check in. The house creaked around him, the walls heavy with ghosts of a life he used to know. His hands trembled as he traced the rim of the bottle, fighting the urge to drown the noise in his head. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the shingles sounded like footsteps. Enemy or ally, he could never tell anymore. And now, there was Maverick, another weight to carry, another life depending on him when he barely had the strength to face his own reflection. The next morning, under a sky streaked with the first grey light of dawn, Jack forced himself out to the pen. Maverick stood near the far corner, head lowered, his scarred flank catching the weak sunlight. Jack's stomach churned as he leaned against the fence, watching the horse's shallow breaths. He didn't know the first thing about caring for an animal this far gone, and the thought of failing again, of watching another life slip through his fingers, made his palms sweat. "What the hell am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered, more to himself than to Maverick. The horse lifted his head, just a fraction, those dark eyes finding Jack's across the pen. There was no judgment there, just a weary recognition, and it rattled Jack more than any IED blast ever had. Days turned into a grueling routine, each one a battle against both Maverick's stubbornness and Jack's own demons. The horse wouldn't eat much at first, turning his nose up at the grain Jack scattered in the trough, and he'd shy away from any attempt at touch, flanks quivering like he expected a blow. Jack didn't push, but every rejection felt personal, a reminder of how little he had to offer. He'd stand by the fence for hours, just watching, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. Sometimes he'd talk, low, gruff words about nothing in particular, the weather, the way the mountains looked under a fresh dusting of snow. He didn't know why he bothered, but something about Maverick's quiet presence pulled the words out of him, even if they were clumsy and raw. It was during one of those long, wordless afternoons, as the Bitterroot Range loomed like a silent guardian in the distance, that Clara showed up again. Her truck rattled down the gravel drive, and she stepped out with a thermos of coffee and a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Heard you ain't sent him packing yet," she said, leaning against the fence beside him. Jack didn't answer, just kept his gaze on Maverick, who was nosing at a patch of dry grass near the center of the pen. Clara poured a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the crisp air, and handed it to him. "You ever gonna touch him, or you just gonna stare him into submission?" Jack took the cup, the heat seeping into his cold hands, and shrugged. "He don't want me near him, and I ain't got the patience to force it." His voice was flat, but there was a crack in it, a tremor of frustration and something deeper, shame maybe. Clara sipped her own coffee, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Patience ain't about forcing, Jack. It's about waiting. You think he's the only one skittish here? Look at you, jumping at shadows. You're just as scared of getting close as he is." Her words hit like a slap, and Jack's grip tightened on the cup, the cheap metal denting under his fingers. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know a damn thing about what he carried, but the truth stung too much. He was scared of failing Maverick, scared of what it meant to care about something again. Memories clawed their way to the surface, unbidden. The weight of a rifle in his hands, the split-second decision that cost his squad everything, the promise he'd made to their families to bring them home. He hadn't. And now, standing here with Clara's steady gaze on him, he felt the weight of that failure pressed down, harder than ever. "What if I mess this up too?" he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, raw with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. Clara didn't flinch, just gave a slow nod. "What if you don't? Some things are worth messing up for, Jack, but you gotta decide if you're gonna keep running from yourself, or if you're gonna face it. Start small. Just get him to trust you enough to eat from your hand, one step at a time." She clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture both rough and kind, and headed back to her truck, leaving him alone with the horse, and a decision he wasn't ready to make. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting long shadows across the valley, Jack sat on the porch with the locked box in his lap. He hadn't touched it in years, hadn't even looked at it. But something about Clara's words and Maverick's silent presence had dragged it out from under the bed. His fingers trembled as he turned the key, the click echoing in the stillness of the house. Inside were the letters, yellowed at the edges, written in the scrawl of men who'd once called him brother, and there was the photograph, his squad grinning in the dust, their faces full of life. At the bottom of the stack was a single folded note, written in his own halting hand, a promise. "I'll make it right, I'll carry you with me." He hadn't. He'd buried them in memory, just like he'd buried this box, because facing it meant facing the part of himself he hated most, the part that had survived when they hadn't. Tears burned in his eyes, a rare crack in the armor he'd built, and he slammed the box shut, shoving it across the table. But the weight didn't leave, it never did. He stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting him like a slap, and found himself at the pen again. Maverick stood there, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of moonlight, and for the first time, Jack felt the urge to reach out, not just to the horse, but to something inside himself. He grabbed a handful of grain from the bag Clara had left, his hands shaking as he stepped into the pen. Maverick tensed, ears flicking back, but Jack kept his movements slow, his voice low. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he murmured, crouching a few feet away, holding out the grain. "I don't even know if I can help you, but I'm here. That's gotta count for something, right?" Minutes stretched into eternity, the only sound the rustle of wind through the valley and the distant howl of a coyote. Then, slowly, impossibly, Maverick took a step forward, then another. His nostrils flared, wary but curious, and finally he lowered his head, lipping the grain from Jack's palm. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through Jack, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since he'd come home, he didn't feel completely alone, but with that warmth came a fresh wave of fear. What if he couldn't do this? What if he let Maverick down just like he'd let everyone else down? The weeks that followed were a slow, painful dance of trust and setback. Jack spent hours with Maverick, learning the horse's cues, the way he'd flinch at sudden movements, the way he'd stand just a little closer each day. But progress was fragile. One afternoon, a neighbor's truck backfired on the highway, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the valley, and Jack froze, his breath hitching as his vision swam with sand and smoke. Maverick, sensing his panic, bolted to the far end of the pen, snorting and pawing at the ground. Jack sank to his knees, hands gripping the dirt, fighting to anchor himself in the present. "I'm sorry," he gasped, not sure if he was apologizing to the horse or to the ghosts in his head. "I'm so damn sorry." Clara came by again a few days later, this time with a worn leather halter slung over her shoulder. She didn't comment on the dark circles under Jack's eyes or the way his hands twitched as he poured her coffee. Instead, she handed him the halter, her voice gruff but gentle. "It's time to take him out of that pen, Jack. Let him feel the open air. There's a trail up by Lolo Pass, wide open, with views of the mountains that'll clear your head. He needs space to remember he ain't just broken. And so do you." Jack stared at the halter, the leather rough under his fingers, and felt the weight of her suggestion. Lolo Pass, a rugged stretch of Montana wilderness, was a place of raw beauty where the Clark Fork River wound through towering pines and jagged peaks. It was also a place of solitude, a reminder of the vastness he used to find comfort in as a boy. But now it felt like a gauntlet, a test he wasn't sure he could pass. He looked over at Maverick, who was watching him from across the pen, and felt the tug of something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe, or at least the shadow of it. But with it came the crushing fear of failure. What if he couldn't keep Maverick safe out there? What if his own fractured mind betrayed them both? The box under his bed loomed in his thoughts, the promise he'd written in that note burning like a live coal. He'd failed his squad. He'd failed himself. Could he really take this horse into the wild, into the open spaces of Lolo Pass, and not fail again? That night, Jack sat on the porch, the halter still in his hands, the distant peaks of the Rockies a dark silhouette against the starry sky. He thought about the letters, the photograph, the weight of a promise he'd thought was dead. He thought about Maverick, whose scars mirrored his own, whose trust was a fragile thread he wasn't sure he deserved. And he thought about Clara's words, one step at a time. If you're still with us on this journey, hit that subscribe button to see how Jack and Maverick face what's coming next. It's only going to get more intense from here. In the quiet of that Montana night, Jack made a decision. One that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no net below. He'd take Maverick to Lolo Pass. Not because he thought he could fix either of them, but because running from pain hadn't worked, and maybe facing it head-on was the only way left. Rising to his feet, he walked to the pen, the halter gripped tight in his calloused hands. Maverick lifted his head, eyes catching the moonlight, and Jack felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made pressing down on him. "We're gonna do this," he said, his voice steady for the first time in days. "You and me. We're gonna see what's on the other side of this mess." And with that, he opened the gate, not just to the pen, but to a path he couldn't turn back from, one that would either break him completely or finally set him free. The gravel crunched under Jack Thornton's boots as he led Maverick out of the pen, the halter's rough leather biting into his calloused palm. The early morning air in the Bitterroot Valley was sharp, tinged with the bite of pine and the faint dampness of dew clinging to the earth. Lolo Pass loomed in his mind, a rugged stretch of Montana wilderness that felt like both a promise and a gauntlet. His decision to take Maverick there hung heavy, a weight that pressed down on his already fractured spirit. Every step toward the old trailer hitched to his rusted Ford felt like wading through quicksand, the kind that threatened to pull him under with every memory of failure. His hands trembled as he adjusted the halter, Maverick's wary eyes locking onto his, searching for something Jack wasn't sure he could give: trust, safety, a reason to keep going. The horse's breath came in short, uneven puffs, mirroring the tightness in Jack's chest. What had he done? What madness had possessed him to think he could lead this broken creature into the wild when he couldn't even navigate the war zone in his own head? As they loaded up, the trailer rattling with every bump on the gravel drive, Jack's mind churned with doubt. The journey to Lolo Pass was only an hour, but it felt like crossing an ocean, each mile a reminder of the stakes. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, the hum of the engine a dull roar against the silence screaming in his skull. Every so often he'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Maverick's silhouette bolt from the trailer, as though the horse could sense the storm brewing in Jack's heart. What if a truck backfired on the highway again? What if the ghosts of Afghanistan clawed their way to the surface, out there in the open, with no walls to hide behind? His pulse raced, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool September morning. He'd lost so much already: his squad, his peace, the man he used to be. Losing Maverick, failing another soul who dared to lean on him, would be the final crack in a foundation already crumbling. The mountains rose in the distance, their jagged peaks like silent judges waiting to pass sentence on a man who'd long ago convicted himself. When they reached the trailhead at Lolo Pass, the vastness of the wilderness hit Jack like a physical force. The Clark Fork River wound through the valley below, a silver ribbon cutting through endless pines, the air heavy with the scent of sap and untouched earth. He unhitched the trailer, every movement mechanical, his mind a battlefield of second guesses. Maverick stepped out, hooves tentative on the uneven ground, his scarred flank twitching as if bracing for a blow that never came. Jack's throat burned as he watched the horse take in the expanse, those dark eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, curiosity maybe, or the ghost of a memory of freedom. But Jack couldn't shake the dread coiling in his gut. He'd brought them here to face something, to step into the open spaces Clara had promised would clear their heads. But now all he felt was exposed, raw, like a nerve-stripped bear under the endless Montana sky. They started down the trail, Jack leading with a loose grip on the lead rope, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending his heart into overdrive. Maverick moved slowly, ears flicking at every sound, but he didn't pull away, didn't bolt. There was a fragile thread of trust between them, woven over weeks of grain offered from trembling hands, of quiet hours spent by the pen. But trust was a brittle thing, and Jack knew how easily it could snap. His boots scuffed against the dirt, the weight of the halter in his hand a tether to something bigger than himself, a responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. The trail climbed higher, the river's murmur fading as they ascended, the world narrowing to just the two of them, man and horse, each carrying scars too deep to name. Jack's mind drifted to the locked box back home, to the letters and the photograph, to the promise scrawled in his own desperate hand. "I'll make it right. I'll carry you with me." He hadn't. Not then. But now, with every step on this unforgiving path, the weight of that promise grew heavier, sharper, until it felt like it might cut him open. The tension built with every passing minute, a taut wire stretched to its limit. Jack's breath came shorter, his hands slick with sweat on the lead rope. He could feel the familiar edges of panic creeping in, the way the shadows of the pines seemed to shift into shapes of men long gone, the way the wind carried echoes of shouts he'd never outrun. Maverick sensed it too, his gait faltering, head jerking up as if he could smell the storm inside Jack. They reached a clearing, a wide expanse of meadow with the Rockies towering like ancient sentinels, and Jack stopped, unable to take another step. His chest heaved, the air too thin, the world too vast. He dropped to one knee, the lead rope slipping from his grasp, his hands digging into the earth as if he could anchor himself there. "I can't do this," he rasped, the words torn from somewhere deep, somewhere he hadn't touched in years. "I can't keep losing. I can't keep failing. Not you, not again." Maverick stood a few feet away, still as stone, those dark eyes fixed on Jack, with an intensity that burned. For a long, agonizing moment there was only silence, the kind that pressed down like a physical weight. Then, slowly, the horse took a step forward. Then another. His hooves were quiet on the soft grass, his scarred body trembling just slightly, but he didn't stop until he stood over Jack, close enough that Jack could feel the warmth of his breath, the faint quiver of his flank. Maverick lowered his head. Not to graze, not to shy away, but to rest it against Jack's shoulder, a gesture so gentle it shattered something inside him. Jack's breath hitched, a sob catching in his throat as he felt the weight of that contact, the first true touch between them, unforced, unearned, a gift he didn't deserve. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words spilling out like a dam breaking, not just to Maverick but to the faces in that photograph, to the men he'd left behind in the dust of Kandahar. "I'm so damn sorry I couldn't save you. I've been running from it, from you, from everything, but I'm here now. I'm here." The confession hung in the air, raw and ragged, carried away by the wind whistling through the pines. Jack's hands shook as they hovered over Maverick's neck, afraid to touch, afraid to break this fragile moment. But the horse didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, a silent witness to a man unburdening his soul. It was as if Maverick understood, as if those haunted eyes had seen their own kind of hell and knew the language of loss. Jack let his hand rest against the horse's coarse mane, feeling the steady rhythm of breath beneath his fingers. And for the first time in years, the noise in his head quieted. Not gone, never gone, but softer, like a distant thunder rolling away over the mountains. It wasn't forgiveness. Jack knew he'd never fully forgive himself, but it was a start, a crack in the armor he'd built, letting in a sliver of light he thought he'd never see again. Days turned to weeks after that moment in the clearing, and Jack wasn't the same man who'd knelt in the dirt at Lolo Pass. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like the way frost melts under the first weak rays of spring. He still woke before dawn, still felt the ghosts linger in the shadows of the old ranch house, but now there was purpose in the ache. He'd head to the pen, now a proper corral he'd rebuilt with his own hands, and there was Maverick waiting, head lifted as if he'd been counting the minutes until Jack showed. Feeding him wasn't a chore anymore. It was a ritual, a quiet exchange of trust that grew stronger with every handful of grain, every brush of hand against scarred flank. Jack started talking more, not just to Maverick but to himself, dredging up memories he'd buried, letting them spill out into the crisp Montana air. Some mornings, he'd even smile, a small, crooked thing but real, when Maverick nudged his arm for an extra treat, as if the horse knew how to coax life back into a man who'd forgotten how to live. His trips to the VA in Missoula changed too. He didn't sit in the back of the group therapy room anymore, boots scuffing the floor, while he stared at nothing. He spoke, halting at first, then steadier, sharing bits of his story, about the war, about the box under his bed, about a horse that had somehow reached into the darkest parts of him and pulled him towards something like hope. The other vets listened, some nodding, some with tears in their own eyes, and for the first time Jack didn't feel like a ghost among them. He started stopping at the diner on the way home. Not for long, just enough to sip a coffee at the counter, to nod at familiar faces, to let the hum of small-town life seep back into his bones. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when the nightmares clawed him awake, still days when the weight of his past threatened to crush him. But now, he had something to hold on to. Maverick, a reason to get up, a mirror that didn't just reflect his scars, but showed him he could still heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Bitterroot Valley, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jack sat on the porch with the locked box in his lap. He hadn't touched it since before Lolo Pass, hadn't dared to face the weight of it again. But now, with Maverick grazing quietly in the corral, he felt something shift inside him. A need to let go, to release what he'd been carrying for too long. His hands didn't tremble as he turned the key this time, the click echoing in the stillness. He pulled out the letters, the photograph, the note with his promise scrawled across it, and spread them on the weathered wood of the porch. The faces of his squad stared back at him, frozen in a moment of laughter, of life, and the ache in his chest was still there, sharp as ever. But it wasn't just guilt now. It was something softer. Something like love. "I didn't bring you home," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the tears burning in his eyes. "But I'm carrying you every damn day, and I'm gonna keep going, for you, for me." He stood, the box lighter in his hands, and walked to the edge of the property where a small wooden cross stood under an old pine, his daddy's resting place, a spot he hadn't visited in years. With careful, reverent hands, he placed the box at the base of the cross, a symbolic surrender of a burden he couldn't bury underground, but could finally lay to rest in his heart. The photograph stayed with him, tucked into his shirt pocket, close to his chest. A reminder not just of loss, but of the men who'd shaped him, who'd believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. It was a sacrifice, letting go of the physical weight of that box, but it was also a promise renewed, not to fix the past, but to live for the future they'd never see. As the last light of day bled from the sky, Jack walked back to the corral, his boots kicking up dust in the fading glow. Maverick lifted his head, ears pricking forward, and ambled over to the fence, pressing his muzzle against Jack's outstretched hand. The horse's breath was warm, steady, a quiet anchor in a world that had once felt like it was always slipping away. Jack stood there, the Rockies a dark silhouette against the horizon, and let the moment settle into his bones. Healing wasn't a destination, he knew that now. It was a journey, rough and uneven, marked by small victories, like the weight of a horse's trust, like the courage to face another day. And in that vast, silent valley, under a sky so big it could hold all the pain and hope of a lifetime, Jack felt the stir of something he thought he'd lost forever. The will to keep walking, to keep carrying the ones he loved, even if only in memory. Time, he realized, wasn't just a thief. It could be a mender, too, stitching together the ragged edges of a soul with threads so fine you didn't notice until you looked back and saw the pattern. War had taken much from him, left scars that would never fade, but it hadn't taken everything. There was still room for recommeso, for quiet mornings and hard-won peace, for bonds forged not in words, but in the unspoken understanding between two broken beings finding their way. And in that silence, in the space between heartbeats, Jack found a truth he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes the act of surviving is itself a kind of victory. If this story reached into your heart, if it reminded you of the power of second chances, comment below with, "I believe in healing." Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who might be fighting their own invisible battles. And if you want to join us for more stories that remind us we're never truly alone, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep walking this path together.